Sarah had always loved flying, the feeling of freedom up in the air, the sound of the engines as they roared to life, the sensation of leaving behind the ground with every takeoff. But this flight was different. It was as if the universe had set something in motion, that she couldn't control the moment. She stepped onto the plane and scanned the cabin. She noticed him, a man sitting in first class, his eyes already locked on her, with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She couldn't explain it. But something about him felt off. He was the kind of passenger who gave off an air of superiority, as if he expected the world to bend to his will. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but there was something about this one that put her on edge. She approached him with her usual smile and asked if he needed anything. He barely acknowledged her at first, then glanced up and spoke in a tone that sent a chill down her spine. He complained about the temperature in the cabin and the position of his seat. She nodded politely and told him she would adjust it for him. But as she turned to leave, he muttered something under his breath loud enough for her to catch. "Great service, huh?" His voice dripping with sarcasm. Sarah's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. There was no room for personal feelings in this job. No matter how rude the passengers could be, they paid for the service, and it was her job to provide it. But something about his attitude gnawed at her. He seemed like one of those people who thought he was above everyone else. She knew the type. He probably thought that because he sat in first class, it meant he could treat people however he wanted. But Sarah had worked too hard to let someone like him ruin her day. Her professional demeanor remained intact, and she made the necessary adjustments to his seat and the cabin temperature. But as she moved through the rest of the flight, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She had a sense of foreboding, an instinct telling her that this was going to be one of those flights that she would remember for all the wrong reasons. She tried to ignore the growing tension in her chest and focused on the rest of the passengers. But she kept stealing glances at him every time she walked past his seat. He was staring at her now with a look of quiet disdain, as if she were beneath him. And the more she saw it, the more her patience wore thin. It wasn't just the words he spoke, or the way he carried himself. It was the way he seemed to believe that his complaints were the only ones that mattered. She had dealt with unreasonable requests before, but there was something about him that felt personal. She knew it was a bad sign when she began to feel anger bubbling up inside her. Normally she would have smiled and moved on, but today something was different. Her nerves were raw. She couldn't stop thinking about the comment he made about her service. It replayed over and over in her mind. And by the time the flight reached its cruising altitude, she had had enough. She had done everything in her power to keep him satisfied. But it wasn't enough for him. She knew that now. And as she walked past his seat on her way down the aisle, she felt a sudden surge of frustration. This wasn't just another complaint. This was a challenge. This was something she couldn't just let slide. She paused in front of his seat, her eyes locked onto his for the briefest of moments before she spoke, her voice steady, but with a hint of steel behind it. "Sir, if you have any further issues, please let me know, but I will not tolerate being disrespected in front of the other passengers." She said, her words cutting through the air, as if daring him to respond. He looked at her with a mix of surprise and amusement. And that's when she knew it was too late. There was no turning back now. She had crossed a line she hadn't meant to cross. But once the words were out, there was no taking them back. And as she walked away, she couldn't help but wonder if she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The rest of the flight felt like a blur. Sarah moved through the aisles as if on autopilot, her smile back in place. But her mind racing, her heart pounded in her chest every time she passed the man in first class. She couldn't stop thinking about the words she had just spoken to him. Had she overstepped? Was she being too harsh? After all, it wasn't like he had physically threatened her or anything. It was just words. But why did it feel so heavy? Why did it feel like she had just made a mistake? She had been in this job for years now, and never had she felt so shaken by a single interaction. But this man, he had a way of making her second-guess herself. she moved quickly to serve the rest of the passengers. But her thoughts kept drifting back to him. Why did he look at her like that, like she was nothing more than a nuisance who existed to cater to his every whim? And then the thought crossed her mind. The moment she had spoken to him in such a way, had anyone seen it? Had the other passengers been watching her and him? Had they seen her lose her composure? Was she now the one being judged by the people around her? It was almost like she could feel their eyes on her as she moved down the aisles. Was she the one who had made the scene, not him? It seemed impossible. After all he had started it, hadn't he? It was his rude behavior that had set her off, wasn't it? But even as she thought that, she felt a small voice inside her saying that maybe she could have handled it differently. She wasn't sure what to do with that voice. She wasn't sure if she should ignore it, or if she should pay attention to it. But before she could answer, the flight attendant call bell rang, and she snapped back into work mode, her hand instinctively reaching for the button to acknowledge the request. She hurried over to the seat where the bell had been pressed, trying to shake off the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. But as she approached, she froze in her tracks. She saw the man from first class, holding up his phone with a smirk on his face. He was taking a picture of her. She stopped in her tracks, her heart sank. What was he doing? Had he really just taken a photo of her? For what purpose? Was he planning on using it against her? Was he going to file another complaint? And this time escalated even further. Her mind raced. She felt her pulse quicken. But she forced herself to remain calm. She walked up to him with a practiced smile, but on the inside her stomach churned. She bent down beside his seat and asked politely if he needed anything, but he simply smirked and said he was fine. But the look in his eyes made her feel small and insignificant. It was as if he knew something she didn't like. He was already several steps ahead of her. And the worst part was that she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever game he was playing, she was losing terribly. She walked away as quickly as she could, but her mind kept running through possibilities. What if he had already sent the photo to someone higher up in the airline? What if he had made it seem like she was the one causing a disturbance on the plane? What if this was the beginning of a much bigger problem? She tried to focus on her tasks, but the unease continued to build. What had started as a minor inconvenience was turning into something much more serious, something she couldn't control. She made her rounds, serving drinks and snacks, but her eyes kept darting back to the man in first class, his phone now tucked away. But the feeling of unease still lingering in the air, like a storm cloud ready to burst. She had no idea what was coming next. But she knew this was only the beginning, and whatever happened next, she was about to find out just how much damage a single moment of frustration could do. The rest of the flight felt like a blur to Sarah. Each minute seemed to drag on endlessly. As she tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in her chest, her thoughts kept drifting back to the passenger in first class, and the photo he had taken of her. She couldn't shake the image of him, sitting there with that smug smile on his face, knowing that he held something over her head. The entire flight felt like a waiting game. Sarah couldn't focus. She went through the motions of serving the other passengers, but all the while her mind was preoccupied with the thought of what was coming next. She had been in the airline industry for years now, and had seen passengers try to manipulate situations for their own gain. But this felt different. There was something about the way he looked at her, the way he had taken that photo, as if he already knew how things were going to play out, like he was in control. And she was just a pawn in his game. She didn't know what to do with that feeling. It gnawed at her as she moved through the cabin. It was a feeling she had never experienced before, a sense of vulnerability and powerlessness that she couldn't escape. But she kept moving, pretending like everything was fine, pretending like nothing had changed. But deep down she knew that something had shifted. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. But the flight was no longer just another routine trip. It had become a ticking time bomb, and she was waiting for it to explode. As the hours passed, she tried to keep herself calm. She reminded herself that she had dealt with difficult passengers. Before that, she had the training to handle anything that came her way. But this time it felt different this time. She wasn't just dealing with a demanding passenger, she was dealing with someone who seemed to have all the power, and no regard for the consequences of his actions. It wasn't until they were beginning their descent that Sarah's unease reached its peak. She had just finished making her final rounds, and was in the galley preparing to sit down. When she saw the senior flight attendant walk toward her, his expression was unreadable, but she could sense something was wrong. Her heart skipped a beat as he came closer, and when he stopped in front of her, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his eyes serious and focused. She felt a lump form in her throat. She knew something was coming, she just didn't know what. And then he spoke. His words came slowly, but clearly. "Sarah, we need you to come to the back of the plane." It wasn't a request, it was an order. Her stomach flipped as she followed him through the aisles, her mind racing with every possible scenario. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this uneasy. All she could think of was the passenger and the photo he had taken, and what that photo could mean. What was it that had triggered this moment? Was it the complaint? Was it the man? Was it something she had said or done? Was she about to be reprimanded, or worse? Was this the end of her career? She had been through so many flights without issue, and now here she was on the brink of something that she couldn't understand or control. They reached the back of the plane, and the senior attendant motioned for her to sit down. He didn't say anything else, but the way he looked at her made it clear that this was serious. Her mind was racing, but she did as she was told. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Now she couldn't sit still, her fingers drumming nervously on her lap. She wanted to ask what was going on, but the silence in the air told her it was better to wait for whatever was coming next. She didn't know how long she sat there before another crew member walked up to her carrying a tablet. He didn't say anything either, just handed it to her. With a sharp look in his eyes, Sarah looked down at the screen, and her stomach dropped when she saw the image of herself glaring at the passenger with that same man holding his phone up in front of her. The photo he had taken was there in full view, and suddenly everything clicked in her mind. She knew the complaint had been filed, and she knew what was coming next, but that didn't make it any easier to face. Sarah stared at the screen, her mind racing, as she took in the image of herself on the tablet. She could feel the blood drain from her face. The photo was crystal clear, capturing that exact moment when she had snapped at the passenger, his smug smile still visible in the frame. She felt her stomach tighten into a knot as she processed what it meant. This wasn't just a casual complaint anymore. This was evidence, the kind of evidence that couldn't be ignored. And that was when it hit her, the magnitude of the situation. Suddenly, everything felt much larger than a simple disagreement between her and a difficult passenger. It was as if she had unknowingly walked into a trap, one that was carefully set up to make her the villain. She could already imagine the words in the report. The image of her looking unprofessional would be plastered everywhere in front of management, and her reputation was at risk, all for a single moment of frustration. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the air in the small space of the galley felt suffocating. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed the tablet back to the crew member. She wanted to ask a million questions, but she knew better than to speak until she was told to. The senior attendant gave her a sharp look, as if to remind her to stay silent, but it didn't help calm the storm in her mind. She could hear the low murmur of voices behind the curtain of the galley, as if they were already talking about her, about what had happened and what would come next. She tried to focus on her breathing, to slow down the panic rising in her chest, but nothing seemed to help. The reality of the situation was sinking in like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Sarah had never felt more out of control in her entire life. She had spent years building her career as a flight attendant, earning her place through hard work and dedication. And now all of that seemed to be slipping through her fingers because of one moment when she couldn't keep her emotions in check. She had always prided herself on being professional, even when dealing with rude and unreasonable passengers. But this time she had let her frustration show, And now it was about to cost her everything. It felt surreal to be in this position. She had always believed that no matter what happened, she could keep her head above water, that no matter how bad the situation got, she could always recover. But this felt different. This wasn't just an angry passenger or a minor issue. This was something bigger, something more dangerous. She could already picture the headlines, the articles, the way people would talk about her. When they heard the story, would they see her as the victim of a rude customer? Or would they label her as the unprofessional one, the one who had crossed the line? It was all too much to process. And yet she had no choice but to sit there and wait for what would happen next. The senior attendant looked at her again, this time his gaze softer, but still serious. "We're going to have to report this," he said, his voice low, as if trying to soften the blow. She nodded numbly. She had expected this. But it didn't make it any easier to hear the words out loud. It wasn't just a reprimand that was coming. It was likely that the airline would take action against her. And the thought of losing her job was unbearable. Sarah had worked so hard to get here, to rise above the challenges and build a life for herself in the skies. And now she was on the verge of losing it all because she had let a rude customer get under her skin. She couldn't stop thinking about what would happen. When the report was filed, what would the airline decide? Would they fire her? Or would they just reprimand her and move on? Or worse, what if they decided to blacklist her from flying entirely? What if she could never work in the industry again? The uncertainty gnawed at her. As the minutes ticked by, she wished she could rewind time and undo what she had said to the passenger. But she knew that wasn't possible. All she could do now was face the consequences and hope that somehow she could salvage what was left of her career. Sarah sat in the small crew room at the back of the plane. The silence around her was deafening. The only sound was the low hum of the engines outside and the occasional shuffle of feet from the flight attendants moving through the aisles. The tension in the air felt thick and suffocating. She couldn't shake the image of the photo from her mind. It replayed over and over in her head. The look on the passenger's face, the way he had caught her in that moment of weakness. She could feel herself sinking deeper into the pit of anxiety. She tried to focus on something else, anything else. But it was impossible. Her mind kept coming back to the one thought that refused to leave her. How could she have been so stupid? She had always been the calm one, the one who could handle any situation with grace and poise. But today she had let it slip. She had let the frustration bubble over. And now she was paying the price for it. She heard the door to the cockpit open and then shut. A moment later, the senior attendant walked in again, his expression grim. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, as if trying to decide how to break the news. Sarah looked up at him, but couldn't find the words to ask. She had already been imagining every possible outcome of the situation, but none of them made her feel better. He sighed and pulled up a chair, sitting down across from her, his gaze fixed on her face. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully." His voice was low and steady, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in it. "The airline has already received the complaint, and they've reviewed the footage and the photo. You're aware of that?" She nodded, but she didn't trust herself to speak. Her throat was dry, her hands trembling slightly. "They're not happy." He continued, his words sinking into her like a weight pulling her down. "This isn't just about one complaint. It's about the way it looks to the public. It's about the image of the airline and how they want to handle this situation." Sarah's stomach churned at his words. She could already hear the words the management would use in their statements, the spin they would put on it. She had always been part of the system. But now she was the problem. She had become the story, the one who had failed the company. And no matter how hard she tried to explain herself, there was no way to turn the tide in her favor. "You need to prepare yourself for the worst," he said, looking at her with pity in his eyes. "They're considering disciplinary action." Sarah's chest tightened as she fought to keep herself from panicking. The worst could mean anything. It could mean a suspension. It could mean termination. She had no idea which way this would go, but the thought of losing everything in one fell swoop was unbearable. Her mind flashed to her life outside the airline. Her rent, her bills, her plans for the future, they had all been tied to this job. The steady income and the sense of purpose it gave her. Without it, she didn't know what she would do. She had worked so hard to get here. She had given up so much to rise through the ranks. But it felt like all of that was slipping away now. She took a deep breath and forced herself to focus on what he was saying. "There's a meeting scheduled with management later today," the senior attendant continued. "They'll make their final decision then, but I need you to understand that this could be the end of your career if they choose to let this go further." Sarah's heart dropped to her stomach at the words. She had always known that working in the airline industry came with its own set of challenges, but she never thought it would end like this. She had never imagined that one moment of frustration could unravel everything she had built. She had always prided herself on being professional, even when faced with the most difficult passengers. But now she had to face the reality that her actions had consequences that could end her career just as quickly as it had started. The senior attendant gave her one last look before standing up and walking away, leaving Sarah alone in the silence of the crew room. Her thoughts were spinning out of control. What would she do if they let her go? How would she survive? What would the rest of her life look like without the one thing she had known for so long, without the career she had built, without the skies to keep her grounded? Sarah couldn't sit still. Her mind was racing in 1,000 directions, each thought a hammer striking her consciousness. Over and over again the clock on the wall seemed to move so slowly, as if time itself was mocking her. She tried to focus on the sound of her breath, trying to calm herself, trying to get her heart rate back to normal. But it was useless. Every few seconds her thoughts would come rushing back to the worst case scenarios. What if they fired her? What if she could never work in the industry again? The fear crept in slowly at first, but now it was a constant presence in the back of her mind. She ran through every possible conversation she might have with management, replaying her words, her tone, her actions, everything she could have done differently. But it didn't matter now. All she could do was wait. She had never hated waiting more than she did in this moment. She had always been able to keep herself calm in difficult situations. But today it felt impossible. She couldn't stop the images from flashing through her head. The man in first class, his smug face, his phone raised up to take that picture of her. She knew that picture was going to be the thing that everyone remembered when they talked about her. No matter how much she tried to explain what had happened, no one would care about the context. No one would understand that it had been a moment of frustration that had pushed her over the edge. They would only see her as the flight attendant who had lost her temper, who had let her emotions get the best of her. The door to the crew room opened suddenly, and Sarah looked up to see the senior attendant standing in the doorway. His face was even more serious than before. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there and looked at her with a look she couldn't quite place. She wanted to ask what was going on, but the words wouldn't come out. She was too afraid to know the answer. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Sarah could feel the air grow thicker with tension, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was unbearable. Then he took a deep breath and began, "I need you to understand something, Sarah. This isn't just about you or your actions on that flight. It's about how the company handles situations like this, how they protect their brand and reputation." His words were measured calm, but they didn't ease her fears. In fact, they only made her more anxious. The idea that this was about protecting the company rather than understanding the human side of the situation made her feel like a pawn in a game she couldn't win. "The higher-ups have reviewed the complaint and the photo, and they've made their decision." He continued, his voice steady, but there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite read, that made her stomach drop. "Sarah, you're going to have to sit down with management. They'll go over everything with you and make their final judgment. But I want you to know that it's not all set in stone yet." Those words didn't bring any relief. Instead, they felt like a double-edged sword. They meant that there was still a chance, but also that she was hanging by a thread. Her mind spun as she tried to process the uncertainty. He gave her a sympathetic look and added, "Whatever happens next, just know that it wasn't an easy decision for anyone." She nodded numbly, but didn't speak. The weight of what he had said hung heavily in the air, and she couldn't find the words to respond. Everything felt like a blur, the moments slipping away as her thoughts spiraled into a frenzy. She wasn't sure how much time passed before she was called into the management meeting. But when the time came, she stood up on shaky legs and walked down the narrow aisle, her thoughts still racing with questions that had no answers. What would they say? How would they treat her? What would become of her? Once this was all over, when she entered the room, she was met with cold silence. There was a long table with several senior figures sitting at it, their eyes watching her closely. She felt like she was being judged from every angle, but they didn't speak at first. They just looked at her, and she felt the weight of their gaze, as if they were waiting for her to crack. She sat down as instructed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and waited for the words that would change everything. The room was cold and sterile, the air thick with tension. Sarah sat stiffly at the table, her hands clenched in her lap. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but none of them made sense. The faces in front of her were a blur, the management team sitting with their stern expressions and cold eyes all focused on her. She could feel the weight of their gaze pressing down on her like a 1,000-pound stone crushing her shoulders. She swallowed hard, trying to fight off the wave of panic that was rising in her chest. But it was no use. Her heart was pounding so loudly in her ears she could barely hear the first words that were spoken. A man at the far end of the table cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low and authoritative. "Sarah, we've reviewed the complaint and the photo. You've been made aware of the situation, and we're here to discuss what actions will be taken." His words felt like a punch to the gut, and she nodded numbly, not trusting herself to speak. Her throat was dry, and her tongue felt heavy. She could feel her palms sweating under the table. Her mind was racing through the possible outcomes, but none of them seemed to end well for her. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, to explain that she had been provoked, that she hadn't meant for things to escalate. But the words wouldn't come. They were stuck somewhere deep inside her. A voice in her head told her it wouldn't matter anyway. They had already made their decision before she even walked into the room. They just wanted to hear her admit her mistake. They wanted to see her grovel and beg for forgiveness. But no matter how much she tried to prepare herself for this moment, nothing could prepare her for the cold indifference that was staring back at her. The man who had spoken before continued, "We understand that this was a moment of frustration for you, and that sometimes emotions can get the best of us. But the way you handled the situation was unacceptable. As a representative of this airline, you are expected to maintain professionalism at all times, and you failed to do so." The words hit her like a slap. She could feel the blood rush to her face. But she didn't speak. She couldn't speak. She wanted to protest. She wanted to argue. But nothing came out. She had no defense. Nothing she could say would change the way they saw her. She had let herself down, and now she had to face the consequences. "We've taken into account your history with the company and your previous performance," he continued. "But this is a serious matter, and we cannot ignore the impact it could have on our reputation. We have a responsibility to protect our brand and ensure that our employees uphold the standards that our passengers expect." Sarah's head spun. She felt dizzy as she tried to keep her composure. They were talking about her like she was a problem to be fixed, not a person who had made a mistake. But she was more than a mistake. She had worked hard for everything she had earned. She had sacrificed so much to be where she was. But none of that seemed to matter now. None of it could undo the damage that had been done. She felt the tears begin to sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. She refused to let them see her cry. She had to stay strong for whatever was coming next. The man leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to deliver the final blow. "We've decided that a suspension will be the best course of action." His words were clear and final, and Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart skipped a beat as her mind tried to process what he had just said. A suspension. She could handle that right. It wasn't termination. It wasn't the end of everything, but it still felt like a devastating blow, a humiliating blow. She could feel the sting of it already. She had worked so hard to avoid this moment. And now here it was, the consequences of one reckless interaction, staring her in the face. She didn't know what to say, how to respond. All she could do was nod and let the words sink in as the room grew quiet once again, waiting for her to speak. But there was nothing left for her to say. The damage had been done, and now she would have to live with it. Sarah sat in the silence of the room as the weight of the decision settled in her chest. It felt like a slow, suffocating pressure that she couldn't escape. Her mind was still reeling from the words that had just been spoken. The suspension wasn't what she had feared most, but it was still a blow, one that she wasn't sure how to recover from in that moment. All she could do was sit there and absorb the consequences of her actions. The room was still and cold, the management team watching her, waiting for her response. But she couldn't find the words. She couldn't bring herself to speak. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart in her ears, the sound of her breathing too loud in the otherwise silent space. The man who had spoken before cleared his throat once again, and Sarah snapped her head up to meet his gaze. His eyes were cold and unreadable, as if he had already moved past this conversation and was just waiting for her to leave. "Sarah, we expect you to take this time to reflect on your actions and your behavior as a professional," he said, his voice steady and impersonal. "We understand that everyone makes mistakes, but this is a reminder of how important it is to maintain the highest standards at all times." His words were nothing new. They were rehearsed and clinical, but they still stung in ways that she couldn't explain. She had heard it all before, but never with this weight, never with this finality. Sarah nodded slowly, still unable to speak. The lump in her throat was too tight. She felt like she was drowning in the overwhelming sense of failure, the humiliation, the sense of loss. It was all too much. She could feel her emotions threatening to break free, but she couldn't let them show. She had to hold herself together for whatever came next. "You'll be placed on suspension immediately," he continued. "During this time, you are expected to stay in touch with HR for further instructions and to ensure that you're ready to return when the time comes." His words felt distant, like they were coming from another world, and Sarah could barely process what he was saying. It all felt like a blur, like she was watching herself go through the motions. But she couldn't feel anything. It was as if the world around her had stopped moving while she was frozen in place. "We expect you to learn from this and to return to work with the professionalism that we know you're capable of." Another voice added from the table, and Sarah felt like the room was closing in on her. She didn't know how much longer she could stay in this room under their gaze. Without breaking down, she just wanted to escape, to run away from the shame and humiliation that were flooding her body. She didn't know how much longer she could sit there without breaking, but she knew she had to. The suspension wasn't the end, but it was a stark reminder of how fragile everything she had worked for was. She had spent years building her reputation, working hard to prove herself, and now it was all hanging by a thread. She could feel the tears threatening to spill over, but she blinked them away, swallowing the lump in her throat as she forced herself to nod again. She couldn't let them see her weak. She couldn't let them see the hurt and the frustration that was tearing her apart. Inside, the silence stretched on as the management team exchanged looks. They didn't seem to be in any hurry to end the meeting, as if they were waiting for something from her, something they would never get. Sarah took a deep breath and stood up slowly, her knees shaking slightly as she adjusted to the weight of her reality. She looked up at the table one last time and nodded once more. "Thank you." She managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper, but they all heard it. They didn't respond as she turned and walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the decision was dragging her down with every movement. When she stepped outside the room, she closed the door behind her and leaned against the cold wall, taking a moment to breathe. She felt the tears finally spill over, but she didn't care. She didn't care anymore. She had been through too much to hold it in, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself break down there in the empty hallway, alone with the quiet of the airport around her. She let herself cry as the reality of everything settled in this wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of something else, a new chapter in her life that she wasn't sure she was ready for.